Welcome to India and Global Left. Today we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Tariq Ali. Tariq is a Pakistani-British political activist, writer, journalist, historian, filmmaker, and public intellectual. He has been a prolific voice on the left for many decades now, and his activist and intellectual accomplishments are awe-inspiring. We will attach a more detailed note on our guest in the video description. For now, let's begin. Welcome, Tariq, to India and Global Left.
Hi, very good to be with you all.
So before we deep dive into the more sort of political questions, why not start on this personal note? You have been a committed leftist for many decades now. When and why did you become a leftist, and why have you committed to be a leftist?
I described this in some detail in my memoirs of the 1960s, street fighting years. But briefly, I grew up in a household that was very radical. Both my parents were communists in the 30s and 40s and later. And the contradiction was that the family itself, apart from my parents, who came from the same extended family, was deeply reactionary or very conservative, whichever way you want to look at it. And so our household, from my point of view, was very special. And the cousins of both genders used to come because it was quite exciting. This is not what they got at their homes. And so we had both the family connections, but also lots of trade union leaders, poets, radical intellectuals, painters, etc., etc. A left bohemian crowd that came through our house regularly. And that's how I became a leftist. I used to listen to them, and I thought that most of what they're saying seems to be right. So from a very young age, I was taught, I think from just my personal observation, that there were different classes in this world, and in the subcontinent you can see these very clearly every single day, either in your own household or on the streets, or in the case of India, where you had class but you also had castes, something the left traditionally, the Indian left, has been weak on. But so that's how I grew up. And then once I could read, I read a great deal. We went to a college in Lahore, an old college, government college, Lahore, which was established, I think, in 1858, a year after the Great Uprising, when the British thought they better educate a few people to collaborate with them. And they set up, Macaulay wrote this famous minute on education in India, where he actually said that. I'm not exaggerating. He said, we need a social layer of people, preferably from the upper and upper middle classes, who think like us, who behave like us, who speak like us, and who are for us. And they produced that, but they knew, and they were not dumb, that there were contradictions, that once you created a social layer which was literate and educated in English, the access to books in English, political books, or say John Stuart Mill, or whatever, would be available. And that they couldn't stop. This is why they restricted education to a very narrow layer. By the time the British left India, the level of adult illiteracy was, I think, 84 to 85%. Not only did they not teach everyone English, they didn't have a good education system because they didn't want to educate people. So all these jokers who talk about how modernizing the British Empire was for India. Literally don't know what they're talking about. But so I was fortunate, I guess, to complete the answer, that I had parents who were very radical. I went to a school where English was taught. I had access to my father had a huge library. So we had access to books in English, written in English, and books translated into English from the state publishing house in the Soviet Union, and later the people's publishing houses in China. So that is, and we were very lucky. The first principal we had in government college law, or I had, was an incredibly cultured, progressive person, a great expert in Punjabi poetry and its importance for the region. And he said to us very openly, because the country was under martial law, military rule, and he said, what you do outside the college, I'm not responsible for. I can't do anything. But as long as you stay in the college, you can have your study circles, read what you like, debate what you like. I will defend you, which was a very courageous thing to do in those times in Pakistan, where the government had banned the entry of all political literature into the country. There was a special ordinance. So that's it.
Interesting. I mean, some of these free spaces in the universities very rapidly diminishing here in India. We'll come to some of them later. So let's deep dive into some of the more sort of political questions. And this is particularly based on your book, The Extreme Center, where you offer a very interesting thesis that the two decades, the decades of the 80s and 90s, that sealed the victory for neoliberalism, pulled the center-left parties to what you call the extreme center. This means the most liberal democracies were reduced to a essentially one-party business system with two organs, albeit that duel in every 4 or 5 years. A change in government, just as in case the Brown Blair government in UK, meant little change of policies with regards to austerity, regressive taxation, privatization of transportation infrastructure, banking, with rising cost of health, education, and housing, all amidst the sea of unemployment. So the thesis basically is the center-left parties drawn to the center, and it is incapable of giving lead to the struggles from below based on these issues. And your book goes beyond Britain, although primarily Britain, but it discusses the European Union. Now, the same book, you rightly mentioned the hopes about the Bolivarian sort of experiment, the very anti IMF protests or in Venezuela, or the anti-privatization of water in Bolivia, and anti-privatization of electricity in Peru, and so on. They have, however, crystallized into bigger movements and organized political parties, and they have come to power. So explain for us this sort of why has it happened? Why has Europe failed to do what the Bolivarian leaders have managed to do in Latin America?
Two reasons. One is that the consensus established in European and North American politics throughout the 80s and 90s, culminating with the collapse of the Soviet Union, meant that they were no longer worried or scared by any groups on the left. For them, the danger about many of these groups, the big mass parties of the Communist Party in Italy and the Communist Party in France, was that the Soviet Union was there behind the scenes to help or not to help, but it was there. And its presence made them nervous. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, And that whole world changed, the results of which we're seeing today in the Ukraine. But once that world collapsed, they had no reason to carry on making any serious concessions to the working class movements in Europe and North America. So if you look at what happened, it's quite stupendous, really. The two largest communist parties in Europe, working class parties, representing, not exclusively, but largely, the majority of the working class in France and in Italy, collapsed. Slowly in the case of France, and dramatically in the case of Italy. I mean, the funeral of the last popular Italian communist leader, Enrico Berlinguer, the inventor of Eurocommunism, the funeral had almost 1 million people on it. But the people who were speaking, of course, there were leaders of the trade unions and the PCI Communist Party leaders, but present were the president of Italy, the Christian Democratic leaders, everyone. So it was as if in his death, as in his life, they were embracing him. And the Italian Communist Party basically lost its grip on working class politics because it was moving consistently to the right. The French party's trajectory was a bit different, but not so different. So the collapse of these two parties in the center of Western Europe created a huge vacuum. And into this vacuum came neoliberalism, the new methods in which capitalism was going to be deployed, and right-wing or nationalist parties took the place of the communist parties. So the picture is a combination of economics, sharp change in the ideology of the consensus that had governed the capitalist world in the West till the 80s, and a total collapse, I would say, of the political culture of the left. Of course, there are small groups, tiny groups and individuals who carry on. But by and large, the culture of the left received a huge blow in Italy and in France. I don't want to exaggerate, because in France in particular, there's still research institutes, etc., who produce useful stuff, even though the emphasis is on empirical data. Nonetheless, this empirical data lends itself to conceptualization, and not necessarily by the writers, I mean Piketty, for instance, but by others. So this big shift marked a new consensus, which made social democracy in Europe seem redundant when it came to power. I mean, Britain is a good example from that point of view, because it's an example being followed slowly, different ways elsewhere in Europe. What was this? It was that effectively Thatcher developed such close ties and links with the United States on every level that there was no difference left, It affected British politics, economics, culture, military adventures abroad, everything. And this was carried on by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, the two Labour prime ministers who followed her, and very openly. They didn't attempt to deny it. They said, we will even go further than her. So that Blairite moment in Europe, other social democrat leaders said, look, Blair's turned to the right, but he's won. and we can repeat this experience. Well, they never could properly repeat it, because the Blair experience itself was taken from Thatcher. She was the one who broke the consensus in Britain, and Blair and Brown carried on, and that's the consensus which is still the ruling consensus, which is why they acted so brutally in destroying and getting rid of Jeremy Corbyn and expelling many, many left-wing members, etc., and just even as we speak. So effectively, a question arose, if you like, let's put it a bit abstractly. How could capitalist rule be most usefully extended and protected, since the big enemies had gone? The small enemies were there, of course, trade unions, but by and large, trade unions tend to fight for economic issues. That is as true now as it's been in this country, in Britain, for a very long time, and in the United States. Just to put in a footnote at this level, that I think what Blair and Brown and Thatcher, but more Blair than Thatcher, wanted to do, and to a certain extent succeeded in doing, is Americanizing British politics. So the country they admired the most was Britain, to such a trivial extent that they started renaming things like the UK border. You never used to see that when you came in, but they started doing it on that level, just mimicking, renaming the Court of Appeal the Supreme Court, etc. And politically and culturally, I mean, if we talk in terms of culture, the British cinema by and large doesn't exist. Either it's funded by Hollywood, or in the case of some radical film directors like Ken Loach, he can't make a movie in Britain where he lives without a lot of support from Europe, where he is almost worshipped as one of our greatest living filmmakers, not in Britain. So in this situation, they decided, what do we need? Too many, politically diverse parties. There is general agreement between the Social Democrats and the Conservatives. The liberal press and the right-wing press don't differ that much on basics. I mean, often over the last 10 years, very partisan pieces in the New York Times were not as crude as Fox News, but basically there was no huge difference. So that is the extreme center. 21st century wars, where the United States can't get its way, they fight. And when the Russians start behaving in the same way, everyone is shocked. And people say, but yes, the Russians. I said, no, the Russians are mimicking the United States. They see the United States can get away with wars and murder and crimes everywhere they intervene, backed by the Western world. So the Russians are saying, well, if they behave like that, we can behave like that, since given that there's nothing progressive about the Putin regime at all, in my opinion. It's a conservative regime, which prior to this was, getting on pretty well with European capital. The oligarchs were embedded in every part, in every major country in Europe and in the United States. So that is where we are now, that political diversity is either crushed, as in the case of Bernie Sanders in the States, or in the more radical case of Jeremy Corbyn, not only is it crushed, but he is effectively suspended as a Labour Member of Parliament. And lots of people supporting Palestine are accused of being anti-Semites and kicked out of the Labour Party. And they don't see any contradiction in the fact that they have this Starmer apparatus has expelled more Jews than ever left the Labour Party. They are expelling all the Jews who are critical of Israel or critical of Zionism and are not Zionists. They're being expelled. So it's a very unpleasant situation intellectually in Britain, where you have the most right-wing conservative government we've seen since Margaret Thatcher and since they destroyed Corbyn, and the people left behind in the Labour Party have been told by Starmer in private that will not let you stand in new seats, in your own seats, if you sort of become too obstreperous. So they were forced to dissociate themselves from a document that criticized Putin, but also NATO, because the criticism of NATO was impermissible for the Labour Party. And that's what I mean, that effectively democracy is being hollowed out. And they don't care what you say about it. They don't care because they feel they're in command, and nothing can really touch them or damage them in their own countries. So we will see what happens. I mean, the situation now is that the French situation is, as you know, pretty dreadful, with Macron, excuse me, with Macron back in power, behaving in the same extreme center way, and the French who went and voted for him to avoid getting the fascist or semi-fascist Le Pen don't know what to do, because Le Pen is now cozying up to Macron and vice versa as to how to keep the left at bay. So all these people who said rather Macron than Le Pen are completely bewildered. At least in France, the left exists to some extent. In Defiant France, the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon and others like him. But in Italy, there's nothing. In Britain, the tiny left that exists in the Labour Party are total prisoners of Starmer. The Stop the War movement, which is very large in Britain, is still there. I wouldn't say that any group today in most of Europe offers either a real challenge or a real alternative. I mean, the German left party is in crisis between those who would like to make their peace with the system and those who still want to fight back. And of course, one big test for this party, which the German bourgeois parties always said was key, was whether they accepted German membership of NATO. Now, it's not that they could ever defeat that, pull Germany out of NATO. The left party couldn't do that. But the fact that they refused till recently to even consider the possibility meant that the Germans were nervous that there was, a large percentage, 10, 15% of people in Germany who are hostile to NATO. And now the party is divided on this issue and debating that. Let's not even talk about Eastern Europe. I mean, these countries moved happily from being satellite states of the Soviet Union to becoming satellite states of the United States of America.
What about the Syriza opponent in Greece and Podemos in Spain? I mean,
Syriza proved to be a total disaster under the government of Alexei Tsipras. He committed political suicide when he called for a referendum and appealed to the Greek people to vote no to the terms being imposed on Greece by the Troika on behalf of the EU, And when the Greek people voted no, he was the big mood in Athens whenever I visited. He went back within 48 hours and rang up all the EU leaders, said, don't worry, we're going to ignore the referendum. And it took people some time to understand what was going on, that the Tsipras decision to ignore the results of the referendum, I think, was the biggest slap in the face of European democracy that we have seen over the last few decades. Just straightforward. It's happened, we are not going to do it, let's carry on. Naturally, the demoralization started, and we all knew, it wasn't a big secret, that sooner or later this government would fall and would be replaced by a conservative government. And that's exactly what happened. So Tsipras moved to the extreme center on many, many issues. They used to have a good position on Palestine, made friends with Israel, told the European Union that they would be loyal members of the EU, failed to fight for the interests of the Greek people. And Varoufakis tells a lot of interesting stories about this. Now, you also asked about Latin America and South America. That's very, different. The origins of democracy in South America are very different. This was regarded by the United States as its backyard. During the First Cold War, the United States, wherever it became necessary, kept military dictatorships in power. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, etc. Some of the major countries. Gradually, democracy was permitted but controlled. And then came neoliberalism, or the new way in which capitalism decided to function. And that brought about a wave of movements from below. So what you had in Venezuela, in Bolivia, under Correa, in Ecuador, to a certain extent under Lula in Brazil, was a swift turnaround on foreign policy. They would not let their countries remain dominated by the State Department or the Pentagon, but also a modest reform proposal, which was instituted. So I characterize this at the time as social democracy based, left social democracy or radical social democracy based on mass movements. That is what gave them the strength to get where they did. And they've suffered blows, we shouldn't deny it, and they've made mistakes, but they're still there. The victory of the left in Colombia, which is the country where the US has bases, where the military is run by a bunch of fascist thugs, let's call people by their real names. In this country, finally, people have said enough is enough and elected a left-wing president and a startlingly eloquent and brilliant vice president, a black woman. This is Colombia today. So the pink tide is not gone out. It's not receded forever. It goes out and then it comes back in again. And they have not been able to bring it under control. And their ways of bringing these things under control are either direct coup d'etats, they attempted two in Venezuela, both of them failed, or then they moved on to getting the opposition to carry out acts of real provocation and recognizing an opposition leader, Juan Guaido, who no one, even the opposition in Venezuela, can't stand him because he's such a crude imbecile. And he looks a bit like Obama, so they thought just by using media images, they'd get away with it. And all their stooges in the in the European Union followed suit. Just withdrew recognition from a government and recognized an imaginary president. So this is the way in which democracy is unfolding internally and externally in the case of most of these countries. But certainly in terms of continents, South America has been the most stimulating. Let us go no further than that.
Thanks. I mean, one of the paradox is the presence of the empire itself and how social democratic experiments have come with opposition to empire in Latin America. In contrast, in Europe, they are.
Yeah, I think I would put it like this: that in Britain, in particular, a huge defeat was inflicted on the workers' movement by Margaret Thatcher when she defeated the miners in the 80s. And that was not just a defeat for the miners, it was a crushing defeat for the entire working class movement. In Latin America, dictatorships had, of course, arrested, imprisoned, killed trade unionists. But a defeat of this character, which is an epochal defeat, from which only recently the British trade unions are beginning to fight back. There are a number of strikes taking place or being discussed as we speak. But in most of South America, they weren't as structured. The trade unions weren't as structured as Britain, with the exception of Argentina. And we then saw a mingling of social movements from below, peasant movements, movements against the privatization of water, movements against the abandonment of state subsidies for the poor in Venezuela, movements against the IMF. All this combined to create a very interesting new melange, which basically said we're going to defeat these guys who've been in power. They're corrupt, they're rogues, they've completely sold our sovereignty to the United States. So the movements began, and they began in different ways in different countries. And, I used to ask the question that the Peruvian peasants who defeated electricity privatization, there's a CNN guy who went to interview them in the mountains in Peru. And they said, "Are you people communists?" They said, "No." They said, "Well, why did you vote against the privatization of electricity?" They said, "Because we are not communists. But one thing we do know, that when the electricity is privatized," he pointed to a mountaintop where you could see lights. He said, "Half those lights will be out and they'll be burning candles. So the poor will suffer. That is why we are opposing privatizations." And I used to point out at the time when I spoke at meetings in Europe, I said, here's the difference, a fundamental difference, that the Peruvian peasants have a class instinct which is much tougher and much stronger than the old, well-established trade unions in Britain, for instance, or the United States. So it was the failure to defeat these mass movements which cost the United States, it's totally slavish governments that they had kept in power in South America. So that contrast, despite all the problems, still remains valid and strong.
Great. Let's move on to my next question. As I reviewed your work recently, and I've been reading your works, one of your major concerns is empire and imperialism. In the Duel itself, one sees the passion with which you wrote and even participated in the justified case of the Bangladeshi national liberation. You have written rightly for the freedom of Kashmir. And more interestingly, you have expressed sentiments of solidarity about with the Scottish independence. You have written that it's not nationalist; it's much more internationalist in the sense that it goes with the sentiment of a common European land. It pushes back against neoliberalism and so on. So empire and imperialism has remained at the center of your focus. And let's come to U.S. imperialism in the AfPak region. So I have two specific questions. A, has the U.S. withdrawn from the AfPak region in general, or has it just withdrawn from Afghanistan? How do you see that? And if it has withdrawn, what are its implications on military's power in Pakistan within the larger power sharing equation? Because historically, the U.S. State Department has stood firmly behind the Pakistani military. And what happens to so to speak, the war or wars on terror in the AfPak region? So these are my two questions on the implication of U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Well, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was very predictable, really. I mean, some of us predicted it from the day they went in. I mean, I actually wrote that this will fail, because they have absolutely no idea what they're going to do in Afghanistan except to occupy it. I mean, it was effectively a war of revenge, because that's where the base of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was. There was no other big reason for it. They were, prior to that, negotiating happily with the Taliban, keeping on friendly terms with them, etc., etc. That everyone knows. I think what their aims were, I mean, they were certainly not women's liberation or democracy, because that never happened in Afghanistan. And actually, the number of rapes went up under the occupation, because while the Taliban were deeply reactionary on gender issues, they did punish rapists, as you can imagine, very severely, in some cases accepting the demand of extreme radical feminists in the United States and castrating them. That happened too under the Taliban. They would beat them, publicly flog them, lock them up, and sometimes castrate them, just to show that women are sacred. Of course, the other side of that was that women were, within inverted commas, protected so heavily that they couldn't develop. So it's weird said that under the occupation, the brothels increased massively, as has happened in every imperial war, or interventions in wars, in Yugoslavia, in Iraq. I mean, some of the most horrific pictures of rape and sexual assaults by American soldiers was in Abu Ghraib, in the big prison in Baghdad. But what the Pentagon covered up, even though they had the photographs, was women behaving in exactly the same way to Iraqi men. I've seen those photographs. Not all, I've seen 2 or 3 of them. Horrific. The same jingoism, the same way of operating. We're on top of you, you bastards. And so, this notion that women entering the armies now is a huge step forward. Well, there are other ways of looking at it. So, the situation if you're talking about Afghanistan in particular, was that from 2005 onwards, it was clear to the more intelligent people in the US administrative services, military and civilian, that they didn't know what to do. They basically had no idea. It got mixed up with this bogus notion of the war against terror, given that most of the terrorist attacks on them were individual or led by small outfits. It was a nonsensical notion. But they got trapped in Afghanistan, just like the Russians had when they went in. And so they were defeated, but not before they had killed tens of thousands of people in that country, starved it, failed to do anything. You know, at least people say the British built a train service in India. Yeah, they did, but mainly to supply goods from one British-controlled city to another. They didn't do it. The Chinese are better like that than that, with some of their initiatives in Africa, but that's a separate story. So yeah, the occupation in Afghanistan failed, but don't think that they've given up on that region, because the big enemy now, China, which for years they regarded as a friend, they opened up their markets, they were allowed entry into Chinese markets, so the Chinese were cleverer. Now Biden and his stooges in Europe are mouthing the same, and of the Australians are targeting China. And the reason for that is very simple. They never thought that China would become such a powerful economic state. It's not militarily, the Chinese are not that powerful, but economically they are powerful and are seen increasingly by many people in the other continents outside Europe as a better alternative to the United States when it comes to dealing with them. I don't believe in the Chinese apologist arguments, which say that the Belt and Braces, Belt and Roads measures are the long march through the world. It's, again, like the British did it. The Chinese have been extremely effective in making the center of the world market shift from west to east. And they are now building a network which can service their needs. The British did it in their colonies in India. The Chinese, these are not colonies, but they're huge trading partners and trading blocs. And I think the plan even is to get a new version of the Trans-Siberian Railway, so that you can get a train from Beijing to Moscow in some amazingly short period of time, something which was a utopian dream at one point earlier. So that is the situation. The American empire is, as I have pointed out many times, is not like the European empires. It doesn't conquer a state and keep it. It's not that type of occupation. Their occupation is economic, soft power, cultural, ideological. They do not, by and large, like occupying a country. So you see their...
With exceptions.
Yeah, with some.
Assassinations.
Yeah, of course. But by and large, they don't like doing that. Of course, internally in the United States, when they were expanding, they did it. I mean, they stole large parts of the West Coast from Mexico. They took French colonies. They kicked out the British. Manifest destiny was the word they used for it. But in the rest of the world, they have tended not to do that. But that doesn't mean that they're not an empire, because empires don't always exist in the same way. I mean, to give you one example, the British, during their imperial triumphs, made more money from investments in Argentina than they did from the whole of Africa, before minerals were discovered in Africa, okay? Why? Because the capture of Africa, together with the other European powers, was effectively designed to make sure that it was a European property divided by European proprietors. No one else, i.e. the United States, is how they used to think at that time, would capture or get hold of it. But, ultimately they had to leave with the results that we've seen. I mean, I have to say that this American historian, Caroline Elkins, I think she's at Columbia or Harvard, her last book on the British Empire, The Legacy of Violence, is very, very brilliant and ends for once and for all the argument that somehow the British Empire was better than the other empires. So, but coming back to the United States, effectively the US wants a hegemonic world in which it exercises either complete or 80% hegemony. They were very happy when the Chinese weren't challenging them. They didn't care what the Chinese did in China. They were very happy when Russia was being ruled by Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and for most of Putin's time. No problems at all. It's when these countries asserted their own sovereignty that they began to get nervous. And it's when these countries said, we've accommodated you so far, but no further, that they began to get nervous. And that is effectively what's going on. They see the rise of China, the fact that Russia can neither defeat them, but nor can it be digested by any European institution. It's awkward. The very, very good text by Perry Anderson in the New Left Review called Incommensurate Russia, which I would strongly recommend to people to read if they want to understand what the big problem between Putin's Russia and the West is. It's not just the Ukraine. So this battle for hegemony is now started and has produced a new Cold War. I mean, what I was saying to you about what happened to the total domination or the one-party statism of politics in Europe is seen very clearly in the media. Exactly the same propaganda on Ukraine. It's looking just from a step back, supporting neither Putin nor NATO. You do see that something is going seriously wrong in Europe. I mean, expelling their tennis players from playing at Wimbledon when they themselves were playing football, the British, English teams, with Nazi Germany. After Hitler came to power. It's just totally crazy, really. That's the word. This is the way they think they're going to defeat Putin, by completely isolating him. His popularity has jumped up since all these measures were taken by the West. At first he was unpopular because he waged the war, but his popularity is now going up again because they basically don't know how to fight him. So the propaganda campaigns, having this clown Zelensky on the cover of Vogue with a pretty woman. Where are we at? I mean, is this this is what politics has come down to, a sort of form of reductionism, which is so crude and which will backfire, actually, without any doubt. So that is what we are witnessing, is in the role which India, under the latest government, but even to an extent before that, because after China, India is the most important country in Asia. The role that they sought to play they didn't want to break off totally with the Russians, regardless of who's in the leadership, because they have many, many old links and military links and weaponry and all that. So they did not vote for sanctions against Russia. The Indians didn't. And that shocked many people who were hoping that India would be completely on their side. But India itself it's not so much a mystery, but its future direction, it's difficult to judge now. I think we need another 20, 25 years before it becomes clear which direction this country is moving in. I mean, I don't believe that the Modi government is going to stay for another 20 years. I don't believe that. I think that things can change much, much sooner than people realize, because while the hegemony of the RSS and the BJP and Modi and his creatures appears to be very strong, and to a certain extent is strong, you have to understand that one reason for this is that there's no opposition. The Congress has collapsed as a political opposition. 3/4, if not more, of their members just repeat the same mantras as the BJP. On the leadership level, they refuse to accept that the sell-by date of the Nehru dynasty is over now, and look for something else. So one reason why the RSS succeeded in establishing hegemony over India, which they have done, by the way, there's very little doubt about it, is that the opposition was useless. And then we've seen now, over the last few years, the collapse of the communist parties. Still in Kerala, they carry on. But, even there, they're immersed in all sorts of corruptions, not that dissimilar to the parties they oppose. It's a sort of different form of the extreme center. It's the corrupt center, if you like. You come into power, and you have your clientele. They have to be paid off, etc., etc. You have to bribe certain key figures in business and the police force, and that's how you carry on. But at least they've survived. In West Bengal, the CPM has been completely wiped out. Completely. The Indian communism has suffered. And I don't think that there will be a coming back, because the last years of CPM rule, both in terms of what they did for their people, what they did to Calcutta, their failure, their stupid, crude attempts to say we're like the Chinese, not understanding which part of India they were in and what needed to be done for ordinary people. There was a real clash between their old traditions of land reform, of pushing for progressive things, and what they turned out to be in the end. And I think people hate that more than anything else. When poor people, when they regard a political party as their own, and when that party lets them down, the shock is much greater, and the anger is much greater. So we have nothing in India like we have in South America. One is that India is in itself a huge country. And there is there are movements and there is opposition, and there will be again. But effectively, a large chunk of the Indian bourgeois and petty bourgeois intelligentsia has for the time being decided to settle in Modi's bed. They feel quite comfortable there. And the others, tiny minority of students, intellectuals who are combating this. I have enormous respect for them because it's a very courageous thing to do. The young people at JNU who came out and protested, the people who keep protesting in Kashmir, in Mizoram, in the tribal areas, the castes who keep struggling in comparison to those who cave in and become part of the system. So it's not that everything is finished or is over, but it's a huge defeat we've suffered for progressive causes in India. And this is very disturbing for the whole subcontinent. For many years, I would say for the first 10 or 15 years after partition, the entire subcontinent, whether it was Sri Lanka or Burma, even from a distance, certainly in Pakistan, used to look up to India as possibly a model we could follow. That is now completely gone. So in the whole of the subcontinent, there is no model for the people, or for these, intellectuals themselves as to who they could support. So there's as a result, a lot of fantasy ideas come and go. So that's where we're at, really. In Pakistan, basically the army controls the show. Everyone knows that, and nobody, neither the political parties nor the army, has a vision for what to do to the country. Self-made billionaires like Riaz Malik come and bribe all the politicians. He's quite open-minded like that. He doesn't mind which party is in power. He'll bribe them. You want 50 million, a billion, okay. He'll bribe the army, he'll bribe the air force. It's a sort of very strange phenomenon that has developed. A single guy can actually do that. Of course, he could be eliminated very rapidly, but they don't eliminate him because he's good at what he does, which is just making money and then sharing a small segment of it with the elite that runs the country. Sometimes I say Pakistan's name should be changed to Malikistan. It's a state of the proprietors, because no progress has been made in terms of the huge class divide that exists there now.
That can act as a common name for both India and
Pakistan.
For both India and Pakistan.
Malikistan, exactly.
Yes.
They could become a confederation, a Malikistan.
Okay, so very quickly, we try to take up two questions if possible. Part of our objectives is to bring to our global audience the lesser known histories of the world. And few people today, even progressives, read the history of Pakistan, not to mention that perhaps Pakistanis themselves care much less. But if one bothers to engage the actual history, there is so much excitement and learning in many ways. You have written a full book on the fall of the Ayub dictatorship. And those years, the late 60s, beginning particularly with on November 1968, and then leading up to the overthrow and the coming of Show. It's a fascinating history in many ways, for particularly those of us who look for possibilities in the past within huge constraints. The question I'd like to ask you, and which was not very clear from my reading of your Duel, is why did Bhutto fail? Was it just because of the U.S. intervention finally that came, in bringing General Zia and some of the implications that happened in the late 70s? Or was it was it the pushback by the ruling class elites against his sort of more social democratic programs that brought him to power in the first place? What do you think?
Look, there are two ways of looking at this. One is that if one remains loyal to the facts, the uprising that shook Pakistan from November 68 to March 69 was the first time that people in Pakistan were united from below. Prior to that, Jinnah's vision of Pakistan, of the Muslim majority states, worked partially at huge costs in what became West Pakistan, Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, Pakhtunkhwa. It never ever worked for East Pakistan, which was East Bengal, first partitioned by the British as an experiment in 1911 by Lord Curzon to see if they could do it. Then big protests, then they united, allowed Bengal to become united again. Satyajit Ray's Ghare Bare is a very good film, actually, to even understand that mood. So in terms of Pakistan, so a huge thing erupts. Student action committees are set up in West Pakistan and East Pakistan. They collaborate, they discuss with each other. I went on a speaking tour of both parts of the country at that time. And the mood was very optimistic, extremely optimistic. Effectively, a left social democratic program, in my opinion, could have been won had the politicians been serious about it. Bhutto's slogan was Roti, Kapda aur Makan, food, clothing and shelter for everyone, which was taken from land, peace and bread, the Bolshevik slogan in 1917. It was effective and it was extremely popular. But what happened? An election, the generals knew they had to permit the country's first proper general election. They did it, and years of discrimination by the West against East Pakistan, where the majority of our people lived, economic exploitation, really on a subcolonial level, semi-colonial level, political exploitation. When the Bengalis formed a united front in 1954, which swept the country, left and center and nationalists, the West Pakistan government stopped it. So political repression, and then a lack of a common language. Jinnah tried to impose Urdu on Bengal in 1948 and was heckled, abused, and had to come back very rapidly to mull over the situation before dying. And no one could impose another language on Bengal for good reason. So these tensions erupted at the elections of 1969, where Bhutto won West Pakistan with a left social democratic program, and Mujibur Rahman, the leader of the Awami League in East Pakistan, won a majority of the seats in East Pakistan, and also he would have been the largest party in Pakistan as a whole. And now the Pakistani elite had a choice. Accept the 6 points for maximum autonomy by the East Pakistanis, have Mujib as Prime Minister of a unified Pakistan, and see how things go. That was vetoed by the military, who didn't like Bengal anyway. And Bhutto, unfortunately, at a crucial moment when he should have behaved like a statesman, didn't. He should, together with all the other parties, many of whom were prepared to say, come on, Mujib, you are our Prime Minister. Many of the West Pakistani elite preferred Pakistan to break up. rather than to allow a elected Bengali prime minister for the whole of the country. Very important and critical period. That's why they can't face it. To this day, they accuse India. Now, I'm not a partisan of Indian policies, as anyone who's read my book knows. But Indian intervention became an issue after the Civil War began. It was not the whole thing. The Indian government didn't organize the election results in East Pakistan. This was the people rising. So they blew it. It's the West Pakistani elite who behaved criminally, and they blew it. Then you had the military intervention in East Pakistan, tens and tens of thousands of people killed, organized rapes of Bengali women by people and soldiers from West Pakistan. All this happened. So Jinnah's Pakistan died. Bhutto was left with a rump state, effectively a truncated state. What to do? Well, he had options. Bhutto was the only Pakistani leader who could have kept the army under some form of control. He didn't do it because power goes to their heads. The generals come and smile like Zia and, suck up to them.
They underestimated too. To some extent.
That's what I'm saying. They completely underestimated, even though the army had been defeated. Huge defeat inflicted by India, which Bhutto could have used. He's quite capable of doing that and saying, okay, enough of these adventures. So he went to Simla, did the deal, got the prisoners released. His standing was very high, but he didn't know how to tackle the military as an institution. That was the problem. And that, coupled with antagonizing many, many good people in his own party, because he's incredibly arrogant, and the way he dealt with oppositions was not good. Not doing deals with the opposition parties when it was necessary, not creating had he created a progressive alliance, the PPP would have governed Sindh and the Punjab, and the National Army Party, in which the left was gathered, would have governed what is now Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan. Perfect deal. The army didn't want that, and Bhutto didn't do it, and he thought he was so clever he could outmaneuver anyone. In the meantime, he made a number of serious blunders, in my opinion. Nationalizing the whole of all main industrial complexes in Pakistan didn't work. What he should have done, and what some of us argued for at that time, was totally reform the countryside. But, not bogus land reforms, but real land reforms. And create a new class of farmers. And that would also have meant many people moving from the countryside to the cities and enlarging the working class. I mean, a process which happened in India, for instance, to a certain extent. He didn't do it because the landlords of Sindh, the worst in the country, were suddenly turned and joined Bhutto's party. They tend to do that. They're not dumb. They know how to preserve and protect their class interests. So they did that. And so Bhutto's reforms were half-baked, and he tended towards authoritarian-style rule. And instead of tackling the army or actually making Pakistan a model state for the rest of the world, they couldn't do that. And one reason, my opinion, they couldn't do that was that all the euphoria and the hope that had built up had begun to collapse with the breakup of Pakistan. So the PPP and Bhutto, as the defenders of what was left of Pakistan, became increasingly nationalistic. And a lot of the social program was lost in this, and fake nationalism without any meaning whatsoever. So the army waited bided its time and struck. But I would say that if you want to talk about mistakes, the PPP was partially at least 50% responsible. And then he'd annoyed the Americans on a number of issues. And they said he's a nuisance, get rid of him. There's no doubt that the army was told this. In fact, after the Duel, my book, The Duel, was published, one of the people who reviewed it in the Washington Post was a veteran CIA and had been station chief in Pakistan. And he said, whether Americans won't like this book, but they should read it because everything that is stated in it about our role is true. So they acknowledged that. And that was the end. Zia then did to Pakistan what Thatcher did to Britain, what Reagan did to the United States, what Modi did to India. He did it before them, but he transformed it and made religion and links with the Saudis and the Gulf states and created them. The Sharif brothers' political party was created by Zia during that period. So that consensus is yet to be broken. And they're so obsessed and besotted now with the Gulf states, largely for reasons of money, that they're trying to make Lahore, parts of Lahore, look like these horrific Gulf cities, and even transplanting palm trees and knocking down the beautiful old plane trees that we've had in the subcontinent for centuries. So this is the state of Pakistan, and it's quite a grim state. It's bad. I mean, look what in Burma, they've just executed political dissidents in public. Sri Lanka has a mess, but at least an opposition has arisen. Once again, the students. India, we don't need to go into because most of you who are listening will know the situation extremely well. Pakistan and Afghanistan recovering from a 20-year American occupation, and before that 20 years of a Russian occupation. I don't know where to go. People are starving, people are dying, and nobody cares. So it's a grim situation, but however grim the situation, those of us who are active or who write or who study, our task really is to keep telling the truth. What more?
Sorry, I will just let you go, but with one final quick question, if you allow. Very quick question. So one of the very inspiring facets of your life is your hold over international politics, and that comes with an internationalist commitment, which is much more refreshing, because hold over international politics can be because of privilege, too. Now, one of the problems we face, and this is true even, I saw this even at JNU, and I went to JNU in 2019 in a huge sort of exciting moment. Began with the anti-fee hike protest movements, where we confronted the fascists at the heart of its capital. Then it sort of merged with the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act and the NRC, which tried to sort of essentially reduce Muslims in India to second-class citizens legally. And then finally, COVID came, but it came with the farmers' protests against the corporate laws. So it was an exciting moment when I went there. Yet I could see that there is a tremendous parochialism in every university, including JNU, about not knowing about other societies. So we wouldn't read any history of Pakistan, any history of Africa, or for that, unless it's a history course and there you have to take a sort of non-Indian paper and so on. You literally don't discuss global politics and so on. And I suspect this is the case elsewhere in other parts of the world. What would be your suggestion to our generation to break through this sort of inwardness and parochialism, and to sort of commit to a more open, progressive politics?
Well, this is a question as you rightly said, applies to large parts of the world. One of the targets of neoliberal ideology was history, because they became obsessed with discussing now, presentism, the present. Forget about history. And history was, really ignored for a long period. It's a big tragedy, this, but I think what we have had is the emergence of the internet, the emergence of possibilities of communicating with each other again, the ability and the ease with which you can make a documentary film very cheaply now. So there are all sorts of these possibilities that exist, and these should be used. More than that, one can't say. In order to look for stuff, you have to first be interested in it. And one of the ironies of globalization has been that with this globalization, there has come a parochialism. In the sort of turbocharged globalization period, there was a lot of interest. I remember coming to speak at JNU in the 70s 3 or 4 times, and once I stayed for a week. Everyone wanted to know what was going on everywhere else, not just in Pakistan or the JVP in Sri Lanka, but all over. And I was constantly questioned because I functioned in different continents as an activist. So that has changed, and that's part of the price we pay for what is happening to the world. And in India especially, I mean, you say they don't know about Pakistan, but I tell you, how many of them know the real history of Kashmir? How many of them know Nehru's decision to kill lots of people in Hyderabad, Gandhi, the pacifist decision to grant the Indian government give the Indian government his blessing as they poured in troops to Kashmir. How many of Indians know the degree of rapes in Mizoram and the tribal areas carried out by the army? So if you study your own country properly, that in a way will take you to other countries, because then you are forced to compare. Are we the only country who behave like this? No, of course not. Similar things have happened in Pakistan, how that country broke up. Similar things are happening today in the United States of America. What is happening in China, what's going on in Xinjiang. So the comparison comes when you know your own country well and know its vices well. Otherwise, we become a doomed generation. And the other thing I will say to you, there is a pattern of protests in recent years, very important protests, the ones in India, students coming out to defend the attacks on the civil rights of Muslim citizens, the occupation movements, Occupy movements on the American campuses, Black Lives Matter. Now, the thing about these protests is, their importance is that it shows there are people there still angry. And it can take one spark and people come out onto the streets, but they go back home very quickly. That's the problem. That they don't think, how can we convert this into a movement of some sort, in a political party of a new type, so not to lose the momentum. And there's no big parties of the left in North America or in India now, which people can join. In the old days, they could join, the pro-Moscow party, the CPM, if they wanted. The Naxalites were an alternative, not a particularly good one, but they were there, very courageous in their own way. That's gone now, apart from a few pockets. So it's not that these things won't arise again, but it's almost as if the history we are taught, little gobbets, what happened in this year in Africa, and you're given one page to learn so you can provide an answer for the exam. The political movements are a bit like that now. come out, everyone is for you, the internet buzzes, explosive, tweets go viral, and then a few months later, all gone. That doesn't mean it won't come back again, but will its form be any different? That's the big question.